This lecture covers Chapter 7, looking at joints and veins. So what is a joint? I know we covered it a little bit before, but a natural fracture not subjected to shear displacement. So the rock breaks brittly, but it doesn't move on either side relative to each other. It just breaks. A vein is a fracture that is filled with minerals that precipitated from a fluid. And that's important because if it's filled with minerals that solidified from a melt, it's not a vein. Then it's a dike or a sill. But if they precipitated from water, it's a vein. Here you can see on a large outcrop or road cut, you can see lots of veins, and you can also see lots of joints that haven't been filled with minerals. That's all of the cracks in the rock, like for example, right here, where the mouse cursor is circling, you can see a joint, a black line, or a couple of black lines, not filled in with white. However, here, where the mouse is circling now, you can see lots of white lines that are veins, old joints and fractures that have filled in with minerals deposited from water. Now, joint surfaces aren't smooth. It's not like somebody took a knife and made a clean cut through the rock. Often, the irregular, non-smooth surface displays a pattern called a plumose structure. This photo here shows a plumose structure on the surface of a rock that fractured, and then somebody took the other half away so that we could see the plumose structure. A plumose structure has a few different parts to it. There's the joint origin. This is where the structure began growing. This is where the fracture, where the joint began. It has a mirror zone. This is the area closest to that origin, and this part of it is quite smooth. That's why it's called a mirror zone. Then, next is the mist zone. The mist zone is where it just starts to get rough, but it's still relatively smooth. And then the hackle zone is where it gets even rougher. Lineations here, called barbs, curve away from the plume axis. You can see here a sketch, and then also, again, the photograph oriented more in line with the sketch. And you can see the origin, the mirror zone, the mist zone, and the hackles. And then the dark lines of the hackle that curve upward, each of those would be a barb or a twist hackle. And then where they line up along the crack at the surface is called the hackle fringe. The hackle fringe is the trace of the twist hackle. So what we have here is we have one joint where the other side of the rock was removed so that we could see the plumose structure. And then we have, and that one's labeled number 1. And then labeled number 2, we have another joint, hasn't made it all the way through, and the rock has not been removed. So now we can see that hackle fringe quite clearly. Now this arrest line, this kind of dark gray line here, forms when basically, the stress is building up, the joint, the crack is growing, and it relieves some of the stress enough that it stops growing for a little while. Then the stress builds up again and it grows some more. And then so you can have a series of arrest lines where the stress builds up, the crack grows, relieving the stress until it stops cracking, and then over time stress builds up again. Sometimes you can see arrest lines very clearly, sometimes you can't. In this photograph here, it's, at this scale anyways, basically impossible to see any arrest lines. If somebody was looking at it with a hand lens or a microscope, they might be able to pick some out. I'm not sure how rapidly that particular rock fractured. There may not be any arrest lines if it was a continuous fracture. So why do we get these plumose structures? Well, if a rock were actually perfectly homogeneous and isotropic, it would fracture into a smooth planar surface. A rock will never be that because a rock is always a mixture of minerals. On the other hand, that's pretty much describing cleavage in a mineral. When you have a homogeneous natural material in the ground, it's probably going to be a mineral. And if it happens to be isotropic, then when it cracks, when it fractures, when you get a joint, it'll be a smooth planar surface. If you take a piece of halite and you stress it with a hammer, it will create smooth planar surfaces. If you take a piece of calcite, a little calcite, sparry calcite crystal, and you break it, hammer, drop it on the floor, whatever, it will create perfectly smooth planar surfaces because it's the homogeneous and isotropic material. It'll break that way. Rocks can't be. Rocks are, by definition, multiple minerals. So it's not going to be homogeneous. It's not going to be the same in all directions. Even the rare cases like limestone, that is only one mineral because it's multiple crystals in different orientations, or oolites, even more oddly shaped. It's not truly homogeneous and isotropic. You have different orientations. So you can't get a perfectly smooth fracture in limestone, even though you could in a single calcite crystal. Now, the reality is that the joints twist and tilt as the joint grows because of these imperfections. We have different minerals contacting each other. We have different orientations of the crystals and grains. We have Griffith cracks. We have lots of different kinds of imperfections and non-homogeneous material, so the joints do not grow flat and smooth planar surfaces. They curve, they twist, they bend, and the stress field at the tip of the crack is changing and intensifying as the crack is growing until it reaches some terminal velocity, which when it's cracking that fast, it adds in little cracks splaying off of it, which add to the curvature and plumose structure. And this goes on until the stress is relieved, and then it stops or it arrests, and you get an arrest line. Now you can have straight plumes, where it basically has a straight axis moving away from the origin, and then the cracks are all curving away from that straight axis. Or, depending on the material, you can have a curvy plume, as shown in the middle here, where the axis that everything is splaying off of is curved. You can definitely have multiple arrest lines. This is a computerized image of a rock where they scanned the fracture, and you can see the multiple arrest lines, and you can kind of see the plumose structure within each arrest line, although it's kind of grainy. Now, the twist hackle, again, is when that joint intersects the surface, whether it's the surface before you get to the next bed, or whether it's the surface meaning the ground surface. When the joint reaches the surface of the rock that it's going through, you get this twist hackle. Sometimes it's very small scale, and so it can look like a straight line. Sometimes it's bigger, and you can see it more easily. This twist hackle, because it's a regular repeating pattern of slightly offset fractures, it becomes an en-echelon joint. That's what you see at the surface, is an en-echelon, basically in series joint. The edge of the fracture plane is also called the hackle fringe. Now here's a close-up photograph. You can see the, get the mouse pointer here. You can see the fracture origin, slightly irregular in the middle of the smoothest region, the mirror region. And right outside the mirror region, it gets slightly rougher. That's the mist region. In this case, the mist region is pretty narrow. And then you get out into the much rougher, and you have the hackle region, and you can see some twist hackle markings where you get something roughly linear going out from the center of where the origin is, and at the edge of the rock you would see that kind of en echelon type line. Now this is at a very, very small scale. You can see up here the scale bar, 100 nanometers. So this is tiny.